My area of interest is learning, education and the internet. I care about this area very much because I believe that education is the way to reduce social inequality and enhance social mobility. So the sorts of research questions that I tend to ask are around the ways that we can use the internet to both enhance our learning opportunities but our access to learning opportunities, to see if we can sort of reorientate society, but also look more carefully at the extent to which the internet may be reinforcing or exacerbating current divides in society. And what I'm going to try and do today is just, as I have started quite a few projects quite recently, is just give you a brief overview of some work that I have been doing and then touch on some of this work that has just started to show the different ways that you can explore this question. Okay, so for the last few years I've been doing quite a lot of work about young people and their experiences and uses of technology for learning, both in formal and informal settings. And it's a really interesting area to work in because there's a lot of myths about young people. There's a lot of hopes and excitement and credit for young people in the savvy ways that they engage in the online sphere. But we also have a lot of people very concerned about the content that they access, stranger danger, all those kinds of problems as well. And I feel that these sorts of kind of everyday common sense conversations then filter down into educational practice in very subtle ways, and it's really important to kind of tackle that with strong empirical data. What we did was we looked at quite a broad range of young people from 9 to 23. We used quite traditional social science methods. We did an Oxis-style survey. We interviewed 200 young people. We did 50 case studies of people's homes and how parents and children interact around technology. And we found all sorts of interesting things. But one of the really key aspects for us was to try and talk about data in ways that really help educational policymakers and practitioners to make a difference. So rather than just rejecting ideas of digital natives, we would create typologies of different ways that young people would use the internet and show the social, educational and contextual factors that would explain how people were using the internet and why. And an interesting theme that ran throughout that research was this issue of digital exclusion. And one example that's absolutely key really is the issue of home access. So in Britain, when you look at 9 to 16-year-olds, about 1 in 10 young people don't have internet access at home. And this has obvious implications, both it's difficult for them to do their homework well, it's difficult for them to engage and socialise with their peers. It's also very important in terms of them using the online world to work out future possibilities and just investigate projects of their own interest. And what we also found, crucially, is that for those young people, they have a very functional way of using the internet. So they go there, do something, come away from it. So they don't develop a kind of experimental, playful approach to technology, which is so important in thinking about keeping up with technology developments and keeping skilled throughout life as they leave school. And this is just one lovely quote. It's changed them. From one of our users who was 14 who didn't have internet access at home. So his way of using the internet was simply to ring up his dad and get him to post materials to him. And we have lots of stories like this about how young people were making their own arrangements to try and deal with this problem. But when we have only 10% in the situation, this is actually more problematic because we kind of assume that all young people are kind of okay and therefore they experience more problems, I suppose. When we look at the older age group, from 17 to 23, we were somewhat surprised to find that there's around 1 in 10 of that group as well who, if you ask them, would describe themselves as ex-internet users. So what they mean by that is that they used to use the internet, but they no longer do. I say describe because they do sometimes use the internet in very infrequent and very unsatisfactory ways, but to them, the internet is something that's so removed from their lives and so not helpful to them because they can't use it very well that they just sort of define themselves differently to the rest of their peer group. And this is fascinating really when you think about how we're trying to support young people through various initiatives online and trying to gain access to services and support when there's this 10% of people who really don't use the internet at all. And the assumptions that we have about those young people are particularly striking. So for Nick, he talks about the job centre thought he could send an email and he couldn't. He didn't know how to do that. And what we find is that when you talk to them about their experiences, why they put themselves in this group, often they didn't have internet access at home. So the only place that they used the internet was at school. Their parents have no experience of internet use, so they didn't get a kind of sense of what the internet could do for them. They didn't get the range of skills that they needed. And so it shows again how crucial school is in these debates. And often I think schools, they could do things better, but they really are kind of at the heart of some of these things. And, you know, if they knew how important they were, perhaps they would be more empowered to do certain things for their groups of kids. So we've written a nice book that was out earlier this year, and lots of academic papers. But one of the really nice things about this project is that we have now developed a collaboration with the city. We're working with all the secondary schools in Oxford City to work on a range of projects that deals with aspects of digital inclusion. So we're starting with a home access initiative so that all 13-year-olds without internet access at home will now have it, and we're going to track what happens to them and support them over the next 3 years. We're also starting to develop ideas around using data in schools to better predict who is likely to drop out, who is likely to become excluded, and to try and develop initiatives to stop that happening. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But after a while I felt like I'd done enough with young people and I needed to move back onto adults again. And so I've recently started a British Academy Fellowship that's looking at a group, which you can't see the title, but are the unexpectedly digitally included. So what I find is I'm very interested in how the internet can support access to learning opportunities throughout life, but what we actually see is that the usual patterns remain. So that those who are better educated and better off tend to take up these opportunities, and those who are less educated are much less likely to. And I got tired of looking at this relationship, and I wanted a new way to look at this problem. I think theoretically and practically we need to do something slightly different. And so if you really look at the data, then you find there's this really interesting group that are very low SES, but against the odds, if you like, do seem to be using the internet for capital enhancing activities. There's not huge proportions of them, but there are a significant small group. And so the idea is that I'm going to use the Oxys data set to really profile these people and see who they are, what characteristics they have, and then go and interview them to see the influence that the internet is really having in their lives in terms of their worlds, if you like. And what we see already is that many of these people are parents. So there's something quite interesting happening here. We saw it in the young people study. Parents often buy technology to help their children, to improve their children's educational circumstances, and it may well be that they are helping themselves at the same time, but it's yet to be decided. Now, in the few minutes I have left, I don't think I can talk about education on the internet without talking about massively open online courses. I think they've had so much hype and attention in the last couple of years. They are again an example where people hoped that they would widen participation to higher education, but what we're actually finding is, from all the data that I've seen, around 80% of people have degrees already who participate in these spaces. But that doesn't mean we can just throw them away and say they're not interesting. What I think is particularly fascinating about this is that you can start to see learning from a very different angle. So you can start to see how people interact online, what they view, how much time they spend online, their downloads, etc. For hundreds of thousands of people. We're looking at 2 MOOCs with over 100,000 in each. And we can relate that data to pre and post surveys, their educational scores, quiz tests, and interviews about the experiences of learning. So we're connecting all of these things in a project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to really start to understand interaction and learning in these spaces, and they could tell us something really quite unique. So just to end on, in terms of the future work, as I said, we're working with all the schools in the city on these issues of digital inclusion, and I think there's some really exciting work around predicting outcomes, so trying to see what happens to certain young people at certain times. And we know from some data from commercial online organisations that they can predict who will drop out of a degree programme just by their sign-up information. So just at the time of signing up, they know if they're going to get their online degree. Quite scary stuff. We also have some stuff coming out of the States that are starting to see that around 12, 13-year-olds, you can start to look at certain factors that will also tell you whether they will successfully finish school. And so I'm really fascinated by this, and we're going to try and do something similar here. to see if we can also predict risk of exclusion. But what really interests me is what do we do with that information? Because there's so many values and decisions to be made there about how we support those young people, or how far we go in trying to keep them within the education system. And these sorts of discussions are not really being had. And the kinds of discussions that the commercial online universities might be having about this could be very different to the kinds of conversations we need to have in the education system in the UK. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Was it 10 minutes?
Could you explain the very colourful charts and massive online courses?
They were just pretty pictures, really. Yeah. So this is just the start of social network analysis to look at the collaborations between different forums. So this is literally talking about a particular topic in a forum. The colours indicate the countries where people came from, but we haven't interpreted them yet. We're just drawing lots of pretty diagrams and trying to work out the important things. We're trying to create a kind of typology to understand how different people interact in these spaces, but it's really hard to do that well. So we're not rushing it, we're just kind of looking at it in lots of different angles. It only started 3 weeks ago, this project, so but, you know, this is as far as we've got. But it's just people often just see online as kind of accessing content, and actually interaction and feeling part of the community potentially could be really important. But we don't really know if they're kind of crowds or communities. We haven't worked that out yet.
You haven't mentioned libraries.
No.
And libraries, of course,
huge.
are very topical.
Yes.
Because they've been closed.
Yes.
And here is a way to increase digital inclusion.
Yes, and we have had some good conversations with various libraries and library organisations about this, because for many of the young people who are excluded, the library is a key place for them to access, because obviously they can access for free. There are still challenges because they can often only use it for half an hour, and so that creates this kind of functional attitude to using the internet, because you've just got to get on there and do your stuff and then go. But it's still an incredibly important site of access. And yes, again, that could be a place where skills could be supported. What's amazing about the kind of ex-users is that they often do want support. It's just that they're so embarrassed to ask for it that they don't. But libraries could be a really good place for those sorts of things to happen. So yeah, libraries are key in this too.
I'm curious if you looked at any benefits of exclusion. Your whole assumption seems to be that if you're excluded, that it's negative.
So yes, I mean, I think I'm taking that from, so we do a lot of qualitative work with young people, and we talk to them about their experiences, and we very rarely come across people who are positive about that. So this notion of a kind of refuse nick or something like that is not something that we found in the ex-users that we spoke to. I think while people are still at school, they tend to just really feel it because all their friends are doing it. When they've left school, for some of them they kind of said, well, it's just not for me, but you could see ways that it would be beneficial in terms of online job search and all those kinds of things. I mean, yes, there are potential risks of using the internet, but I think those risks and those benefits go together, and so it's very hard to unpick them. But from their perspective and their experiences, then they feel they're missing out.
I just wondered, in terms of creativity or independent reading, or I mean, if they substitute lack of internet for broadcast television, that's one thing. If they substitute it for Russian literature, it's a different thing.
Yeah. No, that's very true.
This road story.
But yeah, so we did try and look at it quite holistically in terms of technology use and see all of these different things, but it's a good.
Do you find generational differences within communities of children? Because it seems to me that anecdotal that people who are 17 or 18 just now, a lot of their interaction is dominated by Skype and FaceTime, whereas people who are 5 years older, where Facebook was closer to their lives. So how do you account for that in your research?
So I think that's very true. I think it's the extent to which these things change the nature of what they're doing, so how much it really matters in terms of communication and networking, like if it actually causes differences. And we definitely see a developmental thing, so you see younger children who start to use the internet in more formal ways and get more serious about their education and start to think much more about their online profile And you see that process all the way into work up to 25. We try and always, with the qualitative data, always then have a quantitative component that allows us to track those two things and then put them together so that you can see those differences. But I think while there are some kind of generational differences, I'm quite nervous of stressing that, because then we get back to this kind of digital native, all adults are rubbish.
But I'm sorry, by generation I mean
within, yes, yeah.
And so, for example,
yeah, that's a really good idea.
24, 25-year-olds, most of their social networking was asynchronous, whereas a 16 or 17-year-olds, their online interaction is synchronous.
Yes,
and I wonder what another.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, and we're thinking of doing another project, so we could really unpack those differences. Yeah.
Snapchat.
Yes.
Happening.
As we speak.
With 15-year-olds.
Could I ask about the unexpected late adopters, or whatever they were called?
Yes.
I mean, you said that one of the things seemed to be that they had children, but also your slides seem to imply that they then went on and were using it to build up their own capital.
Exactly.
Is that something you found? Or
so that's what I'm hypothesising at the moment. So I think there are some adults who absolutely buy it for their children and believe that that's the way for their children to do better in life, but they also then look at themselves and think, right, I can use it to benefit my situation as well. And that's kind of slightly different to just young people teaching adults. I think there's something bigger going on there. I think they see it as a tool, kind of like education, that would make their lives better. And I'm still really at the early stages, but I think it could be really interesting to see how they came to those decisions and what influences it's really having. And then we could maybe better understand this relationship between digital and social exclusion in a bit more detail.
About 10 years ago, before the prevalence of home access, we had UK online centres, and there was an awful lot of research which we did at that time, which was related to parents of young children going there, and there was a big correlation. So there's somewhere around government there was a pile of information which is picking up data from UK online centres and the number of people who were pushed into going there because their children are doing this stuff at school.
Yes, I think that, that's really interesting, like that they feel that they should. And in the project that we're doing with the city is that we're actually also having parental classes to get their parents engaged in education, because often they're from families where parents may not have a great deal of education or not like the school, be fearful of the school. So we're trying to link those two things back together and see what happens.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.